In the smoky haze of a late 19th century evening, as the sun dipped below the endless American horizon, a train sliced through the twilight like a jewel on wheels. This was no ordinary locomotive. Inside its private cars, known as Pullman Palace Cars, the elite of the Gilded Age lounged in salons paneled with polished mahogany, their feet sinking into thick Persian rugs. Crystal chandeliers swayed gently with the rhythm of the rails, casting golden light on velvet-upholstered chairs and tables set with silver service. Beds folded down from walls at night, complete with crisp linens and down pillows, while uniformed porters, mostly black men in crisp white jackets, glided silently, offering brandy from cut-glass decanters or fresh oysters on ice. These cars weren't just transport. They were moving palaces, so lavish that foreign dignitaries whispered they outshone the White House itself in private splendor. Presidents traveled in them. Robber barons like Vanderbilt and Carnegie reserved entire cars for weeks at a time, hosting poker games where fortunes changed hands amid cigar smoke and laughter. One car even boasted a private organ for evening concerts, its pipes gleaming under gaslight. For a night you could forget the gritty world outside, the coal dust, the sweat of laborers in distant factories, and pretend you ruled an empire on rails. But cut to today, over a century later, and the scene shatters like fragile china. Scattered across forgotten rail yards in the American Midwest, from Chicago's rusting sidings to abandoned depots in upstate New York, the remnants of these once mighty palaces rot under weeds and graffiti. A warped mahogany panel peels from a derelict shell in a Pennsylvania scrapyard, its velvet curtains long gnawed by mice. In a museum corner somewhere in Ohio, a single restored berth sits under dim lights, smelling faintly of mildew and old varnish, while the rest of its kin were melted down for scrap during World War II, or bulldozed for parking lots after highways stole the rail's thunder. No more chandeliers swing, no porters hurry with trays. These symbols of American excess, which once hauled the nation's richest 1% at speeds up to 60 miles an hour across prairies and mountains, now gather dust or vanish entirely. Some ended up as chicken coops on farms or burned in backyard bonfires. The tracks they rode are overgrown, the stations they departed from leveled for strip malls. What was the pinnacle of luxury in 1890 is just twisted metal today, a ghost of glory swallowed by time. How did it happen? How could train cars richer than the president's own quarters, built at a cost that rivals small fortunes, each one priced at $20,000 or more, equivalent to millions today, plunge from the height of fame to utter oblivion in mere decades? These weren't static mansions doomed by taxes or family feuds. They were mobile dreams, ferrying tycoons while the nation boomed. Yet they crashed harder than the 1929 stock market, leaving behind not just ruins, but a trail of human wreckage. Because beneath the polish lurked ugly truths: exhausted workers toiling unseen, wages that barely fed families, and a racial divide as sharp as the rails themselves. The cars rolled on progress, but progress had a price, paid in blood, sweat, and broken promises. Picture the contrast in motion. Back then, as the train chugged out of Chicago's Grand Union Station around 1885, passengers in a Pullman Palace car savored a multi-course dinner served on fine bone china. The menu featured terrapin soup, canvasback duck, and champagne from France, all prepared in a tiny onboard kitchen where chefs sweated over coal stoves that belched heat into the narrow space. Outside, the same train carried hundreds in cramped coach cars, jammed together on hard benches, breathing coal smoke through open windows. The Pullmans detached at will, hooking onto express lines for the elite's private jaunts, to Newport for summer balls or San Francisco for business deals that shaped industries. One famous car, the White House on wheels, carried President Grover Cleveland on cross-country tours, its baths fitted with marble tubs and hot running water, a luxury most Americans had never seen indoors. Newspapers raved, "Fit for kings," they said, and kings agreed, with European royalty booking rides just to experience Yankee ingenuity. Yet even in their prime, the cracks showed. The porters, those ever-smiling attendants who made the magic happen, worked 400-mile shifts without a break, sleeping on fold-out cots in stifling crew quarters. Paid mostly in tips from haughty passengers, they navigated racism daily, called by slurs, ordered to shine shoes at midnight, while keeping the facade flawless. Strikes brewed as early as 1894, when workers walked out over cuts in pay, only to face federal troops and Pinkerton guns. Blood stained the yards near these very cars, but the trains kept rolling, profits padding George Pullman's pockets. He built a company town around his factories, Pullman, Illinois, where employees lived under his watchful eye, rented homes, company stores, no unions allowed. It seemed perfect, a model of industrial harmony, but resentment festered because freedom came at a cost no one wanted to pay. Fast forward to the ruins, and the irony bites deeper. By the 1930s, cars once rented for $175 a night, thousands in today's dollars, sat idle as Ford's Model T, and later airplanes lured the rich away. Diesel engines replaced steam, but Pullmans couldn't compete with the freedom of roads. World War II scrapped hundreds for metal, wartime needs trumping nostalgia. Post-war, the few survivors limped on Amtrak lines until the 1970s, then vanished. Today, a handful endure in museums like the preserved Ferdinand Magellan car at the Gold Coast Railroad Museum in Florida. Its Art Deco interior faded but evocative. You can tour it, touch the worn leather, but the echo is hollow. The smells are gone, the polish, the leather, the faint perfume of cigars, replaced by dust and echoes. So what force turned these rolling Edens into junk? Was it just progress? Or something darker? Greed that squeezed workers dry? Innovation that outpaced opulence? A society that tired of excess? The Gilded Age promised endless ascent, but gravity pulls hard. These cars embodied the dream. Speed, comfort, power. But dreams on rails derail, and when they do, the fall exposes the rot beneath. Stay with us as we uncover the man behind the cars, the obsessions that built them, and the tragedies that tore them apart. Because in the story of the Pullman Palace Cars, luxury wasn't just expensive, it was built on fragile tracks, waiting to buckle. Word count 872. Enter George Mortimer Pullman, the man who dreamed up these rolling palaces and turned a simple idea into an empire of excess. Born in 1831 in upstate New York to a family of modest means, his father tinkered with bending wooden roof shingles for buildings. Young George grew up watching America's railroads explode across the land. By the 1850s, tracks snaked from coast to coast, hauling freight and people faster than ever. But travel was a nightmare. Passengers jolted on hard benches through dust storms and rain, sleeping upright or on filthy floors, dodging thieves and cholera outbreaks. George saw the chaos firsthand during a business trip from Buffalo to Chicago in 1858. Stuck overnight in a muddy rail yard, shivering in a cramped coach car, he vowed to fix it. Not out of pure kindness, though. George was driven by a fierce ambition to rise above his roots, to craft something that would make him indispensable to the railroad kings like Vanderbilt, and to etch his name in gold letters across the nation. He wasn't a rags-to-riches inventor in the classic sense. George had a knack for business and a stubborn belief in his own genius. After moving to Chicago, a booming rail hub rebuilt from the ashes of the Great Fire, he partnered with a friend to experiment with elevated houses on jack screws, saving them from floods. But his real passion lay in trains. In 1864, at age 33, he unveiled his first sleeping car, the Pioneer. It wasn't much by later standards. 4 berths per side, a washroom, and oil lamps. But it had spring mattresses and curtains for privacy, a far cry from the open cattle cars people endured. President Lincoln's funeral train used it in 1865, parading the body from Washington to Springfield. And suddenly George Pullman was famous. Orders poured in. He quit construction, borrowed money, and founded the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1867. By cutting deals with railroads, offering his cars for a share of ticket sales, he built a monopoly. Rail lines needed his luxury to attract passengers, and he supplied it, raking in profits that swelled to millions. Yet George's drive came laced with control. He wasn't content to just build cars. He wanted to shape lives. Tall, stern-faced, with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing eyes, he dressed like a banker and spoke with the calm authority of a man who believed he knew best. His ambition masked a paternalistic streak. He'd dictate how his workers lived, ate, and even voted. In 1880, he created the town of Pullman just outside Chicago, a pristine utopia of red brick row houses, a library, a theater, and a hotel, all company-owned. Workers earned steady wages assembling cars in vast factories, but rent went straight back to George, and prices at the company store stayed high. No alcohol, no strikes, no independent newspapers. He called it progress, a way to keep order and boost loyalty, but it bred quiet rage. Employees whispered that Big Brother Pullman watched too closely, fining them for muddy shoes or late church attendance. George's wife and 4 children lived in comfort, but even at home, his obsession with perfection strained things. Dinners were formal affairs, vacations planned to the minute. Money flowed because railroads were America's arteries. George made his fortune not from mining or oil, but from comfort amid discomfort. By the 1870s, his cars hosted the elite, Vanderbilts sipping champagne en route to their yachts, Astors plotting marriages in private drawing rooms, even European princes testing Yankee luxury. One car, the 1876 Deluxe model, cost $18,000 to build, over $400,000 today, and featured stained glass windows, a buffet pantry, and a gentleman's smoking lounge with leather armchairs. George traveled in his own flagship, the Pullman, entertaining investors while the train hummed at 50 miles an hour. He patented everything: the folding upper berth, the ventilator system, the porcelain sinks. Ambition fueled him. He aimed to civilize rail travel, proving that Americans could outdo Europe's grand hotels on wheels. But beneath the vision lurked ego. Competitors like Woodruff sleeping cars faded because George undercut them with superior polish and ruthless contracts. He leased cars only to compliant railroads, blacklisting dissenters. His personality shone in the details. George was a teetotaler who banned booze from his town, yet his cars served fine wines to passengers. He built a church for workers but paid the minister from company funds, ensuring sermons praised harmony. Family life mirrored the contradictions. His daughter Florence married into society, but George meddled, approving suitors like he approved blueprints. By 1885, his net worth topped $20 million, making him richer than many industrialists, yet he pinched pennies on worker pay, sparking the first murmurs of unrest. Ambition blinded him to the human cost. He saw employees as cogs in his grand machine, vital but replaceable. Strikes loomed, but George pressed on, unveiling ever grander cars with marble fireplaces and silk wallpaper, convinced his dream was unbreakable. This was the man who turned gritty rails into gilded veins, a visionary with a tyrant's grip, chasing immortality through luxury. He built not just for profit but to prove that one man's will could redefine travel, elevating the masses while elevating himself higher. But ambition, like George's, always demands a toll. Workers in his factories hammered panels from dawn till dusk for wages that bought little more than bread, their backs aching as mahogany gleamed under varnish. The town of Pullman looked idyllic from afar, with flower-lined streets and a man-made lake. But inside homes, families scrimped because rent ate half their pay. George hosted banquets for tycoons, toasting the future, while porters trained for his cars learned to swallow insults with a smile. He dreamed of a world where his cars linked empires, but the rails ran on resentment, and resentment builds pressure until it blows. George Pullman's origin wasn't a fairy tale. It was a blueprint for hubris. From a muddy rail yard epiphany to a palace-building magnate, he embodied the Gilded Age rush: forge ahead, dazzle the world, ignore the cracks. Yet those cracks widened with every mile his trains rolled. His fortune bought power, but not loyalty. And as his cars multiplied, so did the shadows they cast. The dreamer had arrived, but the obsession was just beginning, pulling him, and everyone around him, toward the edge. George Pullman's obsession took shape in the sprawling factories of his company town, where the air hung thick with the tang of sawdust, varnish, and hot metal. By the late 1870s, he wasn't content with basic sleeping cars anymore. He demanded rolling masterpieces that would shame Europe's finest hotels, and he poured his fortune into making it happen. The Pullman Palace Car Company churned out luxury cars at a dizzying pace, one every few days during peak years, each one a feat of engineering madness that blended woodworking artistry with industrial brute force. Workers, numbering up to 12,000 at the height of production, toiled in vast halls longer than football fields, their hammers echoing from dawn until the gas lamps flickered out at midnight. Shifts stretched 12 hours or more, 6 days a week, because George wanted perfection and perfection didn't sleep. And factories hummed with lathes carving intricate scrolls into oak panels, steam-powered saws slicing mahogany imported from Honduras at great expense, and polishers buffing brass fittings until they gleamed like gold. The cost per car skyrocketed. A standard Palace model ran $20,000 to build in the 1880s, about $500,000 today, while deluxe versions topped $30,000, rivaling the price of a city mansion. George invested millions overall, scaling up from a handful of cars in 1867 to over 2,000 by 1893, because railroads across America clamored for his rolling status symbols to lure the wealthy away from cramped coaches. But this frenzy of creation hid a grim underbelly, as excessive as the luxuries themselves. George's blueprint for each car started with sketches in his Chicago office, then exploded into reality through layers of skilled labor he squeezed for every penny. Carpenters, many immigrants fresh from Ireland or Germany, shaped undercarriages from iron and steel strong enough to handle 60-mile-an-hour speeds over rickety tracks, while upholsterers stitched velvet from France and silk damask that cost a worker's monthly wage per yard. One insane detail stood out: the observation lounges in flagship cars like the 1881 Harvester, where George installed full-sized pipe organs shipped from Boston, their ivory keys and brass pipes tuned for impromptu concerts as the train crossed the Rockies. Another extravagance came in the private baths, marble tubs quarried in Italy, plumbed with silver-plated fixtures and hot water heated by coal stoves that scorched the tiny onboard galleys. Chefs' domains featured copper pots from England and ice boxes stocked via platform stops, all to serve lobster thermidor at midnight. These touches impressed tycoons, who paid $150 a night to rent a car, thousands today, but they drained resources, forcing George to cut corners elsewhere, like worker wages frozen at $1.50 a day while lumber prices soared. The construction process unfolded like a well-oiled machine, but one powered by human strain. Raw materials arrived by barge on Lake Calumet, tons of hardwood soaked in chemicals for durability, plate glass from Belgium cut to fit arched windows that flooded interiors with light, and Persian rugs knotted by hand in far-off looms. Teams of 50 men per car assembled the shells in 2 weeks flat, frames bolted, walls paneled, roofs waterproofed with rubber seals George's patents protected. Painters applied 20 layers of lacquer to dining tables that seated 12, inlaid with ebony and mother of pearl. Electricians wired early models with Edison bulbs by the 1880s, a novelty that flickered romantically over cut crystal decanters. George inspected personally, striding the factory floors in his tailored suit, barking orders to tear out flawed panels or redo stitching because second best isn't Pullman. This quest for flawlessness built an empire. His cars covered 80% of America's luxury rail miles by 1890, but it exhausted the workforce, who breathed varnish fumes that burned lungs and triggered coughs they called Pullman fever. Injuries piled up, crushed fingers from presses, falls from scaffolds, heat stroke in unventilated sheds during Chicago summers that hit 100 degrees. Safety gear was scarce because it slowed production, and George preached that discipline built character, even as families buried sons too young. Excess pulsed through every nail and seam. Take the 1889 series. Each car weighed 60 tons, longer than a city bus at 72 feet, with compartments that converted from sofas to double beds via hidden levers, patented mechanisms that clicked smoothly under gloved hands. Brass spittoons lined smoking rooms for the cigar-chomping elite, while ladies' parlors boasted full-length mirrors framed in carved walnut, reflecting gowns worth a porter's yearly tips. George spared no detail for onboard service. Hidden dumbwaiters ferried meals from galley to salon, and call bells summoned attendants who bunked in cramped rear compartments smelling of sweat and coal dust. He even designed vestibule connections with flexible rubber flaps, so cars could link seamlessly for private trains, hauling Vanderbilt's guests from New York to Palm Beach. The numbers dazzled. Over $10 million spent on factories alone by 1885, employing blacksmiths who forged axles from Pittsburgh steel, and glaziers who etched transoms with floral motifs. Yet for all the opulence, the human toll mounted. Child laborers as young as 12 sweeping shavings, women sewing curtains for pennies per hour, all under the watchful eyes of foremen who docked pay for whispers of unions. This obsession crowned George as rail royalty, his cars the talk of Gilded Age society pages, but it sowed seeds of destruction amid the splendor. Workers built palaces they could never board, living in company row houses where rent clawed back half their earnings, while George summered in Europe scouting fabrics. The town of Pullman, meant as a showcase, turned prison-like. Arc lights patrolled streets at night, banning loitering because idle hands bred trouble. Fines for immoral behavior, like playing cards, hit paychecks hard, and when a depression struck in 1893, George slashed wages 25% but kept rents fixed, igniting fury. The construction boom blinded him to the breaking point. Cars rolled out polished and proud, but the factories ground men down, their resentment building like steam in a boiler. Beauty demanded sacrifice, and George's madness made sure the elite never smelled the blood on the varnish. These weren't just trains. They were monuments to one man's will, extravagant enough to eclipse the White House, but fragile as the egos that forged them. The palaces gleamed on the outside, but inside the machine that built them, pressure mounted, waiting for release. Once aboard a Pullman Palace car, the world outside blurred into a ribbon of prairie and mountain, and for the elite passengers, life unfolded like a private dream of endless indulgence. Imagine settling into a velvet armchair in the salon as the train pulled away from Grand Central in 1888, the conductor's whistle fading behind you. Crystal glasses clinked with imported champagne, and a porter appeared with a silver tray of caviar on toast points, his white-gloved hand steady despite the car's gentle sway. Dinners stretched into the night, turtle soup steaming in porcelain bowls, followed by roast pheasant carved tableside under the glow of brass lamps, all washed down with Bordeaux from cellars older than the Republic. After dessert, perhaps Charlotte Russe topped with sugared violets, guests retired to drawing rooms for whist or poker, where stacks of $100 bills piled up beside cigar humidors stocked with Cubans. Vanderbilts hosted bridge tournaments that lasted dawn to dusk, while Astor heiresses gossiped about Newport rivals, their laughter echoing off carved cherry panels. Presidents like Benjamin Harrison traveled incognito, dictating speeches from fold-down desks, while aides polished boots in adjacent compartments. Even Queen Victoria's son, the Prince of Wales, rode one in 1879, marveling at the silk-shaded windows and the hot towels delivered hourly. For $100 to $200 a night, thousands in today's money, these cars offered escape, full baths with scented soaps, libraries of leather-bound novels, and phonographs spinning Wagner for bedtime. Tycoons closed million-dollar deals over brandy, sealing pacts with handshakes as the train crossed state lines, feeling invincible in their cocoon of comfort. But this gilded bubble hit a cage of isolation and quiet despair, because luxury on rails came with chains no amount of money could loosen. Long journeys, 3 days from New York to Chicago, bred boredom despite the distractions, as passengers stared at the unchanging horizon, trapped in a steel box rocking endlessly. Seasickness struck even the hardiest, turning marble tubs into misery chambers smelling of vomit, masked by lavender sachets. Social rules strangled fun. Gentlemen smoked only in lounges, ladies changed 5 times a day into fresh corsets and bustles, and dinners demanded formal attire, complete with tiaras for the women. Marriages strained under the confinement. One Vanderbilt wife reportedly wept nightly in her berth, homesick for her stable while her husband flirted with the chorus girl in the next car. Scandals simmered. Illicit affairs sparked duels postponed until stations. Jealousies flared over who got the best compartment, and fortunes evaporated in card games where losers jumped off at dawn stops, too ashamed to continue. Children aboard whined from the heat of coal stoves that baked the air in summer, while winter drafts whistled through seals, forcing fur lap robes even in silk-sheeted beds. The elite pretended bliss, but letters home confessed the truth. "It's beautiful, yet suffocating," wrote one industrialist's daughter, "like a jewel box too small for the heart." Money bought the finest trappings, mirrored wardrobes, electrified calling bells, even private secretaries, but it could not erase the loneliness of speed, the nagging fear of derailments that killed dozens yearly, or the hollow echo of laughter when the porter turned down the gaslights at midnight. Beneath it all labored the invisible army that kept this fantasy alive, a workforce of porters and cooks whose sweat and silence powered the machine. Mostly black men recruited from the South after the Civil War. They numbered hundreds per fleet, trained in Chicago depots to anticipate every whim without a word. A porter's day began at 5 a.m., making up 12 berths with fresh linens trucked from laundries, polishing silver until it burned fingers, and stocking ice boxes with oysters fetched from iced freight cars. They served 20-course meals in swaying galleys where grease splattered from sizzling pans, then cleared tables while dodging elbows at 50 miles an hour. Shifts ran 24 hours with catnaps on floor mats in rear compartments that reeked of coal smoke and unwashed uniforms, because breaks meant lost tips, their main pay, often a quarter from passengers who treated them like furniture. Yet racism poisoned every interaction. Slurs hurled casually. "Boy, fetch my slippers." Tips withheld for slow service. Shoes shined at 3 a.m. without thanks. Women cooks, hidden in steamy kitchens no bigger than closets, scalded hands on soup pots for $20 a month, their families back home scraping by on what they sent. No tunnels linked their world to the elites, but hidden service corridors ran the length of cars, letting porters glide unseen like ghosts, emptying chamber pots into trackside pits at stops. George Pullman praised their loyalty, but paid them $35 monthly plus tips that averaged pennies, forcing many to moonlight unloading freight. Exhaustion bred errors. A spilled tray cost a week's wages docked, and injuries went untreated, because the train never stopped for a porter's broken arm. This contrast defined life inside. Opulence for the few, drudgery for the many, and a fragile peace held by resentment. Passengers rang bells for midnight snacks, oblivious to the porter shivering outside in February blizzards to fetch coal. Tycoons toasted progress, but their happiness cracked. Divorces announced via telegram mid-trip, suicides rumored in locked lavatories, proving that no rug silenced the rail's rattle or filled the void wealth created. The cars rolled smoothly because porters oiled axles by hand at depots and mopped vomit without complaint, but whispers of unions spread in crew bunks, fueled by hunger and humiliation. One porter, later a strike leader, recalled shining Vanderbilt's boots while hearing deals that beggared his kin in southern fields. Ladies lounged on chaise longues reading French novels, yet confided to diaries about loveless beds and absent husbands glued to business ledgers. Even George, inspecting his masterpieces, sensed the tension. He added more bells and bigger galleys, but ignored the human strain. Money built the cage, velvet walls, silver service, endless champagne, but trapped everyone inside it. Passengers in ennui, workers in chains. Happiness fled the rails like smoke from the stack, leaving only the illusion of perfection. The dream seemed eternal as the train crossed endless plains, but the cage rattled with unspoken pain, and pain, like a loose rail, eventually derails the whole line. The music stopped abruptly in the spring of 1894, when the boiler of resentment finally exploded in a strike that shook the nation and shattered George Pullman's empire. It started quietly enough, as economic panic gripped America after the silver crash of 1893. Railroads slashed orders for new cars, factories idled, and George, stubborn as ever, refused to budge on his company town's rents or cut executive pay. Workers, already stretched thin by 12-hour days and choking varnish fumes, saw their wages drop 25% while grocery bills climbed because the company store jacked prices. Families went hungry. Children scavenged coal scraps from tracks to heat homes. But George saw it as temporary, a test of loyalty, and preached patience from his mansion overlooking the lake. He hired detectives to spy on union talk, fined men for disloyal whispers, and evicted families who complained. Resentment boiled over on May 11th, when 4,000 workers walked out of the Pullman factories, their tools clattering to the floor as they marched arm in arm down flower-lined streets that now felt like enemy lines. They didn't strike alone. Eugene Debs' American Railway Union joined in, boycotting any train with a Pullman car, halting 125,000 miles of track from Chicago to the Pacific. Suddenly, the rolling palaces sat stranded on sidings, their mahogany salons silent, chandeliers dark, while porters and cooks joined picket lines, their white jackets traded for protest banners. The villain wore many faces, but greed and arrogance led the charge, with federal power as the brutal enforcer. George Pullman, safe in his New York office, branded the strikers anarchists and thugs, refusing arbitration because he believed his town was his private kingdom. Railroads begged him to compromise, but he dug in, hiring scabs, untrained replacements bussed in under Pinkerton Guard, who bungled repairs and sparked fistfights at gates. Violence erupted on July 4th near Blue Island Yards. Rocks flew, cars torched, blood-soaked gravel as crowds of 10,000 clashed with armed deputies. President Grover Cleveland, pressured by bankers like J.P. Morgan who feared halted mail trains, sent 14,000 federal troops and U.S. Marshals, their bayonets flashing under summer sun. Machine guns raked picket lines. 30 died, hundreds wounded, including black porters shot while waving white flags. Debs landed in jail for 6 months, his union crippled, but the damage cut deepest for George. Headlines screamed Pullman tyrant, cartoons mocked him as a bloated king on rails, and public outrage turned his name toxic. The strike cost railroads $80 million, but George lost more. His monopoly cracked as lines sought rivals, and a government commission branded his town a feudalism that enslaved workers. He won the battle, forcing most back under threats of blacklisting, but the war for his soul was lost. Porters whispered of revenge, tipping less, sabotaging subtly, over-polished silverware that slipped from trays, beds made just loose enough to creak all night. That brutal summer marked the turning point, but deeper forces gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. George's health crumbled under stress. He retreated to his Chicago mansion, a shell of the stern patriarch, while lawsuits piled up and banks called loans. The cars still rolled for a time, ferrying Vanderbilts through the panic, but cracks widened. Passengers grumbled at delays. Porters unionized quietly under A. Philip Randolph by 1925, demanding fair tips and hours. Yet the real killer lurked in garages and skies. Henry Ford's Model T, cheap at $850, let tycoons drive their own roads by 1910, dodging rail schedules for spontaneous jaunts to the Hamptons. Airplanes followed. Charles Lindbergh's 1927 flight slashing cross-country time from days to hours, making palace cars seem pokey relics. The 1929 stock crash hammered the final nails. Railroads bankrupt, elite pinched purses, cars mothballed in Chicago yards under snowdrifts that rotted velvet. George died in 1897, broken and vilified. His body sneaked into Graceland Cemetery at night to dodge grave-robbing strikers, but his legacy limped on. World War II sealed the doom. Uncle Sam scrapped 1,000 Pullmans for aluminum and steel, furnaces glowing red as marble tubs and organs melted into bomber parts. Survivors rattled on Amtrak until 1971, then auctioned off. A 1905 car fetched $5,000 in 1950s sales, stripped for diners or summer camps, its panels auctioned like war souvenirs amid dust and bidders' calls. Picture the final scenes, haunting as fog on empty tracks. In 1930s Chicago sidings, weeds choked wheels of the once proud Harvester, its pipe organ warped by rain leaking through cracked roofs, mice nesting in silk cushions that smelled of mold and rust. Foremen padlocked doors, porters laid off with $10 severance, walking away with boots crunching broken glass. Auctions unfolded in rail yards under gray skies. Velvet chairs sold for $2 apiece to antique hunters. Silver service hawked from tarps for scrap value. Crystal decanters shattered in hasty packing. One last private train in 1941 hauled dignitaries to a war bond rally. Lights flickering on brass as the engine wheezed its farewell. Smoke curling like a dying breath before the crew uncoupled it forever. Depots where queens once boarded stood boarded up, vines twisting around faded Pullman Palace signs. George's town? Sold off piecemeal after his death. Row houses auctioned, the hotel bulldozed, lake filled for factories, leaving empty lots where workers once marched. Porters' families denied pensions scattered to cities, their stories fading like echoes in tunnels. Tycoons who loved the cars jumped to Cadillacs and private jets, forgetting the rails that carried their rise. The dream derailed not in one crash, but a slow grind of progress outpacing polish, greed blinding the builder, and workers' fury exposing the lie. Lights turned off one by one across the fleet, darkness swallowing salons where fortunes were made, leaving only the wind whistling through hollow shells. The palaces that outshone the White House now gathered shadows, their tragedy a warning etched in twisted steel. Excess rolls fast, but when the tracks buckle, everything tumbles. Today, the Pullman Palace Cars exist as scattered ghosts, fragile echoes of their former splendor, tucked away in museums, junkyards, and forgotten corners of America. But they whisper a story far removed from the glamour they once commanded. Walk into the Gold Coast Railroad Museum in Florida, and there she sits, the Ferdinand Magellan, a hulking 1930s survivor once reserved for presidents like Franklin Roosevelt. Its Art Deco body painted presidential green, but faded and scarred by decades of neglect. You can step inside, run your fingers over the worn leather seats in the lounge where FDR plotted war strategies, and peer into the armored bedroom with its vaulted door, built after an assassination attempt. But the air hangs heavy with dust and synthetic polish that can't mask the faint rot of time. The chandeliers dangle crookedly, their crystals dulled, and the galley kitchen, once alive with clattering pots, now displays rusted utensils under yellowed labels. Tickets cost $20, but the thrill fades fast because this is no living palace. It's a taxidermied relic, preserved by volunteers who sweep pigeon droppings from the vestibule and chase vandals from the tracks outside. Nearby, in the roundhouse at the Illinois Railway Museum outside Chicago, a handful of restored Pullmans gleam under spotlights, mahogany panels buffed, velvet reupholstered. But even here the magic feels forced, like a costume on a skeleton. Guides recite facts about George Pullman's patents, yet they skip the bloodier chapters, because who wants to linger on strikes amid the shine, but venture beyond the glass cases, and the true legacy reveals itself in ruins that stretch like open wounds across the Midwest and beyond. In a sprawling scrapyard near Gary, Indiana, once a rail boom town, the husks of dozens of Pullmans rust in towering stacks, their wheels sunk in mud, panels pried off for scrap metal that fetched pennies during the 1950s post-war boom. Vines snake through shattered windows where queens once gazed at sunsets, and graffiti tags the faded gold leaf that spelled Palace Car, while rainwater pools in warped floors that once cradled Persian rugs. Further west, in abandoned sidings along the old Santa Fe line in Kansas, feral cats prowl the shells of 1890s models turned into makeshift sheds by squatters, their interiors gutted for firewood, brass fittings long melted down. Some fared worse. During the Great Depression, farmers in Iowa dragged cars off tracks to serve as chicken coops, feathers sticking to remnants of silk wallpaper, the smell of ammonia overpowering any ghost of champagne. Others burned in accidental fires or deliberate blazes set by kids in the 1960s, frames twisting into black skeletons that bulldozers shoved into landfills for highway expansions. Even the company town of Pullman met a quiet end, its red brick homes subdivided and decayed, the Grand Hotel razed in 1922 for a gas station that now pumps fuel where tycoons once parked private engines. Today, a neighborhood called Pullman stands in its place, but the lake is gone. Factories leveled for warehouses and plaques mark the strike graves without naming the dead porters who fell. This physical decay mirrors a deeper human wreckage that time hasn't scrubbed away, because the Pullmans didn't just rust. They left scars on the people who built and served them. The porters, those black men who polished silver through slurs and strikes, formed the backbone of a civil rights fight that outlasted the cars themselves. Philip Randolph, a Pullman porter turned Union pioneer, channeled their rage into the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925, the first major black-led labor group in America. But victories came slow. Fair wages not until 1937, after years of tip-dependent poverty that left families in Chicago tenements. Many descendants still live nearby, sharing oral histories of grandfathers who shined Vanderbilt shoes by lantern light, their tips buying school books while bosses like George hoarded millions. Yet racism lingered. Even in the 1960s, white passengers shorted black porters, and Amtrak's final Pullman runs in 1971 evicted the last crews with no pensions, forcing retirees onto welfare lines. Strikes like 1894 echoed in labor laws. The Clayton Act curbed federal troops, but workers paid first, with widows begging at factory gates and children orphaned by Pinkerton bullets. George himself rests uneasily in Graceland Cemetery, his grave guarded even now by iron bars he ordered before death. fearing dynamite from vengeful ex-employees. His family scattered, daughter Florence sold off assets in genteel poverty, the fortune squandered on lawsuits and failed ventures, proving dynasties derail too. Modern echoes persist in unexpected places, a final twist on the tragedy. Hollywood props pull from survivors. One 1904 car stars in films about train robbers, its saloon repainted for shootouts that mock the real violence of 1894. Tourists snap selfies in restored lounges at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, oblivious to the onboard galleys where cooks scalded hands for $20 a month. Rail fans restore stragglers in backyards, welding frames for heritage lines that chug tourists at 20 miles an hour. But breakdowns remind everyone, these beasts were never meant for nostalgia. Amtrak nods to the past with sleeper cars, yet they lack the organs and marble, opting for vinyl over velvet because excess lost its appeal. The rails themselves, uprooted for bike paths or buried under interstates, the endless prairies now crossed by semis hauling Amazon boxes, progress marching over the graves of palace cars. In the end, the Pullman Palace Cars teach a hard lesson from the Gilded Age. Ambition builds wonders that dazzle the world, but it crushes the hands that forge them, and no fortune shields against the march of time. They were richer than the White House once, rolling empires on steel, yet today they crumble into dust, proving that nothing, not even the grandest dream, lasts forever.